We bought the Yancey County property because it was what we could afford, and because the bones were right, which is what you say when you mean that the structure has enough quality in its original construction to justify the work required to make it livable again. My wife Therese is a contractor, and I am an electrician, and between us we have the specific practical competence to look at a house that needs significant work and understand the work clearly rather than being surprised by it, which is the thing that kills most renovation projects. Not the work itself, but the discovery of the work after the purchase. When the budget is committed and the surprises are no longer surprises, you can walk away from. We had been looking for a project property for 2 years, and the Yancey County ranch house at the foreclosure price met the numbers in a way that nothing else we had found in that time had met them. We made our offer through the bank and closed in April. I want to describe the property accurately because the description matters to understanding what we found and when we found it. 4 acres in the western part of the county, the house sitting in the lower portion of the acreage with the land rising behind it toward a ridgeline, the backyard sloping gently up toward a tree line. The house itself was a 1960s ranch, single story, 3 bedrooms, the kind of construction that was done well in that era, in that part of North Carolina, the materials adequate and the workmanship consistent, and the result, a house that 40 years of deferred maintenance had diminished but not compromised. The bank's listing had described it as vacant and unsecured since the foreclosure, which was 2 years prior, and the listing was accurate. The house was empty, the utilities off, the yard in the state of 2 years of unmowed growth that a property in the mountains achieves when nobody is cutting the grass. The previous owner had been a man named Harlan Vess, who had died at 81 after living alone on the property for the last decade of his life following the death of his wife, and who had no children and no immediate family to claim the estate, and whose property had been in foreclosure since the death. We did our walkthrough on the closing day, a Thursday in April, and we found the house as expected: empty rooms, disconnected utilities, the specific smell of a structure that has been sealed for 2 years without climate control. Therese walked the structure's perimeter, and I walked the interior, and we confirmed what our pre-purchase inspection had shown us. And we were satisfied with the purchase, and we were thinking about the work ahead rather than looking carefully at the backyard. It was only when I went out the back door to assess the condition of the rear foundation that I noticed the path. It ran from the back door straight across the yard to the rear of the property, perhaps 60 feet, ending at a garden plot that I could see at the yard's back edge where the mowed area gave way to the tree line. The path was not mowed, it was worn. The grass along its length compressed and pale in the specific way that a path becomes worn when it has been walked consistently over time. The grass not dead but suppressed, growing lower and finer than the surrounding grass, the way grass does when regular foot traffic keeps it from reaching its natural height. The surrounding yard was 2 years of unmowed growth, knee-high in places, the heavy-headed seed grasses of a field going wild. The path was not. The path was the path of a yard that was being used. I stood at the back door and looked at it, and then I walked it. The garden plot at the end was a roughly rectangular area, perhaps 12 by 15 feet, enclosed by a low timber border that had been constructed with some care. The soil inside the border had been worked not recently and not consistently, but worked in the way of a garden that has received attention at irregular intervals, the surface showing the disturbance of turning, and the presence of a few deliberately planted things that I identified as garlic from the green tips coming up through the soil, and what appeared to be some kind of root vegetable, still in the ground from the previous year. Someone had been in this garden. Someone had been walking to this garden from the back door of the house I had just purchased. I called out toward the tree line. Nobody answered. I walked back to the house and told Therese what I had found, and she came and looked, and we stood together at the path's beginning and talked about who might have been using it. The most obvious explanation was a neighbor who had been cultivating the plot informally during the vacancy, which happens with abandoned gardens in rural areas where people with kitchen gardens take the opportunity of an unattended plot. We had not yet met any neighbors. We decided to ask around and not make assumptions, and we moved on with the business of planning the renovation. We spent the first 2 weeks after closing doing assessment and planning and materials acquisition, not yet doing primary work. We were not yet staying on the property overnight. We were driving up from our home in Asheville 3 or 4 days a week, which was a 40-minute drive. Each time we arrived, I walked the path as part of my routine check of the exterior, and each time the path was as fresh as it had been on the closing day. Not more worn, not less worn, maintained, which is the word I want to use and which is accurate. The grass on the path stayed compressed and pale while the surrounding yard did its thing. I began cutting the yard on the third week and left the path. There was no reason to leave the path. I left it because disturbing it felt like the wrong action, and I did not examine this feeling carefully enough at the time. In the fifth week, Therese suggested we install a camera. This was practical rather than alarmed. We had materials on the property, tools, equipment we were accumulating for the renovation, and a motion-activated security camera, pointed at the back of the house, was reasonable property management. We ordered one and installed it above the back door, aimed at the yard and the path. We set it to record on motion detection and to store footage to a cloud account that I could review on my phone. The first week of camera operation produced footage of birds, of a deer crossing the upper part of the yard at the tree line, of the wind moving through the grass in a pattern that triggered the motion sensor, and gave us several minutes of empty swaying grass. I reviewed the footage each morning on my phone over coffee, and it was unremarkable. On the 8th morning, I opened the app and found a clip time-stamped 4:17 a.m. The clip was 47 seconds long. The camera's night vision rendered the yard in the flat gray-white of infrared imaging, the grass pale, and the tree line dark, and the path running straight from the camera's perspective toward the garden. In the first seconds of the clip, the yard was empty. Then a figure was on the path. Not appearing, I want to be precise about this, because the precision matters, not stepping into frame from outside it, but present in the way that a figure is present when the camera triggered on their motion rather than catching them entering the frame. The figure was on the path, moving away from the back door toward the garden, and the motion that had triggered the camera was already in progress when the clip began. The figure was an elderly man. I say this with the confidence of someone who has thought carefully about what I could see and what I could not. And what I could see was the body language of an elderly man, the specific forward lean of old age, the shorter stride, the deliberate placement of each foot that people develop when their balance is no longer the given it was in younger years, the slight asymmetry that old injuries and old joints produce in a person's gait after decades. He was wearing work clothes. He was moving with the ease of someone following a route they know so well they do not need to think about it. He went to the garden. The camera's angle allowed me to see him crouching at the plot, not clearly. The distance was at the edge of the camera's resolution, but crouching in the posture of someone working close to the ground, someone tending something at soil level. He worked for approximately 20 minutes. The clip was 47 seconds. The camera's motion detection had triggered on his arrival and would trigger again on his return, but the middle of the clip showed him at the garden, the static garden, with the figure working in it. The yard between them and the camera empty and still. He straightened. He walked back toward the house on the path with the same deliberate gait, the same forward lean, the same careful foot placement. He reached the area near the back door, which was off frame from the camera's position. The camera was mounted above the door and could not capture the immediate area below it. The clip ended. I watched the clip 4 times before I got up from the table. I watched it on my phone, and then I connected my phone to the television and watched it on the larger screen, and I sat with what I was looking at, and I thought carefully about the explanations. A neighbor using the garden path was still an explanation. An elderly neighbor who came before dawn because he was accustomed to early rising and because it was his habit. The fact that he walked to the back door at the clip's end, rather than to the property boundary, was concerning, but not inexplicable. Perhaps he needed to check something at the house. Perhaps the path from the garden to the property line ran through the backyard near the house. I was working to keep the ordinary explanation available. I drove to the county assessor's office that afternoon and asked about the property's previous owner. The woman at the counter was helpful in the way of county offices in small mountain communities where the staff has often known the families of the properties they administer. And when I gave her the address, she looked it up and said, "Yes, Harlan Vess," and she asked if I was the new owner, and I said yes. She said Harlan had been a good man and that she was sorry the property had gone through what it went through. I asked her if he had kept a garden. She said he had kept a garden his whole life, that gardening was the thing he did after his wife died that kept him in the routine of living, that he had been in his garden every morning until he couldn't be anymore. I asked what she meant by couldn't be anymore. She said that in the last weeks before he died, he had been too weak to go out in the mornings and that he had told his neighbor, she gave me the neighbor's name, a woman who had checked in on him, that not being able to get to his garden was the hardest part. She said he had died the following week. I drove home. I did not go to the property. I sat in our house in Asheville, and I watched the clip again on the television, and I looked at the figure on the path and at the specific way he walked, and I thought about an elderly man who had spent decades walking that path every morning and who had told a neighbor that not being able to get to his garden was the hardest part of dying. And I thought about what it means when something that has been the organizing habit of a person's life for decades does not stop because the person has. I have not told Therese what I think. I told her the clip showed an elderly man who I thought was a neighbor using the garden and that I was going to talk to the neighbors about it. She said that was reasonable. I talked to the neighbor. The woman at the assessor's office had named a woman in her 70s who lived half a mile up the road and who had known Harlan Vess for 30 years. I described what I had seen. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What time did you say?" I said 4:17 in the morning. She said that was when Harlan went to his garden. She said he had gone every morning at 4:15 or 4:20 for as long as she had known him. She said he went before light because he liked the garden in the dark before the day started, that he said the garden was different before light and you had to be there to understand it. She said this looking at something past my shoulder rather than at me. I said thank you and drove home. The camera is still up. The footage still comes. He is there most mornings at 4:17, walking the path with the specific gait of someone who has walked it thousands of times, working in the garden for 20 minutes, walking back. We have begun the renovation work and the property is becoming what we purchased it to become. I have not disturbed the garden. I have not overgrown the path. Therese has not asked me why the path is always walked looking, and I have not offered an explanation. And some things in a renovation project are not the project. And the morning walk to the garden of a man who could not stay away from it is, I have decided, not my project to interrupt. I bought the McDowell County farmhouse because I was 41 and had been renting my entire adult life and had decided, with the specific resolution of someone who has been deciding the same thing for several years without acting, that I was going to own property before I was 45. The estate auction was not my first choice of acquisition method. I would have preferred a standard sale with inspection and disclosure and all the procedural protections that a normal transaction provides. But the McDowell County farmhouse came to my attention through a colleague who tracked estate auctions and who sent me the listing with a note that said the bones were good and the price would be well below market and that I should look at it. I looked at it. The bones were good. The price at auction was 31% below the comparable market value for the area. I made my bid with the understanding that I was purchasing a property as is, with no representations or warranties, which is the understanding you bring to every estate auction. And I won the bid and drove to McDowell County a week later with a truck and an empty Saturday and the intention of beginning to understand what I had bought. The farmhouse was a 1940 structure on 11 acres in the eastern part of the county. The house a two-story frame with a covered porch and a barn that was beyond salvaging and a kitchen garden that had gone wild. The previous owner was named Dorothy Slade. This I knew from the auction documentation. She had been 87 when she died and had lived in the house for 51 years, moving in as a young married woman and staying as a widow for the last 20 years after her husband's death. She had no children and no surviving siblings, and her estate had gone to a distant cousin who had appeared at the county courthouse, claimed what was liquid, and declined to deal with the property, which is how properties end up at estate auctions, with their contents inside and their former lives intact. The contents were the thing I had not fully prepared for, which is naive in retrospect because the auction documentation had noted contents included, but which in practice meant something more than I had processed from the listing. The house was not empty. The house was the house of a woman who had been living in it the previous month and had not come back. Dishes in the cabinet in the specific arrangement of someone who uses certain dishes more than others, the everyday ones at the front and the good ones behind. Clothes in the closets, organized by season and by frequency of use in the way of a person who has been dressing themselves from the same closet for decades. A magazine on the kitchen table A regional gardening publication opened to an article on late-season bulb planting, a margin note in pencil beside one paragraph. Food in the pantry, the dry goods, the canned goods, the half-empty bag of flour with a rubber band around its neck, the specific texture of a life still present in the vessel of the life. I spent that first Saturday doing a full inventory rather than beginning any work. I walked every room with a notepad and I documented what was there, and I made decisions as I went about what to keep, what to donate, what to dispose of. The process took longer than I expected because I kept stopping to look at things, not in a morbid way, but in the way you stop when you encounter objects that have been carefully chosen and carefully kept, and that tell you something about the person who chose and kept them. Dorothy Slade had been a gardener. Clearly, the books on the kitchen shelf were mostly gardening books with the specific wear of books consulted regularly. She had been a reader of a certain kind of novel, the regional historical fiction that people in these counties read and that fills the shelves of every estate sale in the mountain communities. She had kept a careful household. The bedroom I noticed last. The master bedroom was at the end of the upstairs hall, south-facing, the windows looking over the kitchen garden. The bed was a solid wood frame, the kind made in the early part of the last century, with the specific intention of lasting, and that has lasted. The wood dense and dark with age and use. The headboard plain, and the footboard matching. It was a double bed, not king, not queen, the double of an era, when double was the standard. And it was made up with a quilt and 2 pillows, and the specific neatness of a bed that has been made the same way for decades. I noted it as, keep on my inventory, and I moved on. I moved in 6 weeks later after completing the minimum necessary work, the electrical update that the inspector had flagged, the roof repair on the back section, the cleaning that a house occupied by its previous life requires before it can begin to become your house. I brought my own furniture for most rooms and left Dorothy Slade's kitchen intact because the kitchen was fully functional and because dismantling and replacing a functional kitchen was not in my budget or my timeline. I kept her bed because I had said I was keeping it, and because the frame was genuinely better than anything I would replace it with at my price point. I bought new bedding. I made the bed with my own sheets and my own quilt, and I slept in it on my first night in the house, and slept well in the way you sleep when you have completed a significant transition and your body is done with the effort of it. The first morning I noticed it. I attributed it to my own movement during sleep. The right side of the bed I was sleeping on the left, which is, my habit was depressed in the specific way of a side of a bed that has been slept on. The pillow slightly compressed in the center, the sheets carrying the warmth that a body leaves in bedding, the mattress showing the gentle, conforming impression of weight. I had moved during the night, I assumed, and had spent some portion of the night on the right side without being aware of it. I remade the bed and went about my day. The second morning was the same. The third morning was the same. By the fourth morning, I had begun to attend to it as a specific observation rather than attributing it routinely to my own movement, and what I noted was that the depression in the right pillow was consistent, not a random distribution of pressure from a person turning, but the specific centered depression of a pillow that a head has rested on in one position for an extended time. My own pillow showed the same. The right side of the bed was being used in a pattern consistent with someone sleeping through the night on that side, not with someone rolling over from the left. I switched sides on the 5th night, deliberately, to test what I was observing. I slept on the right. In the morning, the left side, the side I had vacated, showed the depression and the warmth. I lay in my bed on the right side on the 6th morning, and I pressed my hand flat on the left pillow, and the warmth was there under my palm, in the way of warmth left by recent occupation, the specific residual heat of a body that has been present and has recently departed. I lay there with my hand on the warm pillow for a while, and I thought about Dorothy Slade, who had slept alone in this bed for 20 years, and what the left side of the bed would have meant to a woman who had slept beside someone in this frame for 30 years and then slept in it alone. I moved to the second bedroom that night. The second bedroom was smaller, with a narrow bed I had brought from my apartment, and it was unambiguously mine, nothing of Dorothy Slade's in it. No history in the furniture, no accumulated decades of someone else's sleeping in the mattress. I slept in it, and in the morning I went to the master bedroom and looked at the bed. The left side was depressed. The left pillow was compressed. I pressed my hand to it. It was warm. I ordered the camera that week. A basic indoor security camera, wireless, positioned on the dresser facing the bed. I pointed it to cover the full frame and tested the angle and the night vision, and I set it to record continuously rather than on motion detection, because I wanted to understand the timing rather than just catching events. I spent the first night in the second bedroom, knowing the camera was running, and I did not check the footage in the morning, because I had decided I would wait 3 nights before reviewing to have a pattern rather than a single event. 3 nights later, I opened the footage on my laptop at the kitchen table with my coffee. I watched at 16 times speed, the empty room blurring past, the night vision rendering everything in flat gray white. The bed was made. The room was still. I watched and nothing happened, and nothing happened. And then at what the timestamp showed as approximately 2 to 10 in the morning, I slowed the playback to normal speed. The covers moved. I want to be precise about how they moved because the precision is what makes it what it is, rather than what a camera artifact or a draft or a simple thermal shift might produce. The covers on the left side of the bed moved in the specific way of a person settling into a bed they have been settling into for years. Not abruptly, not startlingly, but with the slow, deliberate motion of someone pulling a quilt to a comfortable position and adjusting their weight and finding the posture they find every night, because they have been finding it in this specific bed for a very long time. The left side of the covers settled. The pillow on the left was briefly compressed in the center by something I could not see pressing on it. The bed showed the impression of occupation on the left side, and then it was still, and the room was still, and the timestamp continued, and I watched the rest of the night at 16 times speed, and the room was empty, and the bed held its impression until the footage ended. I watched the clip twice. Then I made my coffee and I sat at Dorothy Slade's kitchen table in Dorothy Slade's house, and I looked at her gardening books on the shelf, and I thought about 51 years in a house and 20 years of sleeping in a bed, alone, on the side that was yours and your husband's, side still being his side across the empty years. And I thought about what it means when a life in a place is long enough and complete enough that the place remembers it. And I thought about whether I should stay or go, and I poured a second cup of coffee, and I stayed. I sleep in the second bedroom. The master bedroom is furnished and clean, and the bed is made with Dorothy Slade's quilt, which I found in the cedar chest at the end of the bed, and which I put back on the frame because it seemed right. I do not review the camera footage anymore. I run the camera because I started running it, and stopping it would feel like a decision I am not ready to make. The left side of the bed is depressed in the mornings. The left pillow is warm. I have come to understand this as what happens in a house where someone has been for a very long time and has not entirely left, and I have decided that this is information about the house I bought and not a problem to be solved. Dorothy Slade lived here for 51 years. She knew where she slept. She is, apparently, still sleeping there. I am sleeping in the second bedroom, and the house is mine and hers both. And on the mornings when I go to the master bedroom door and look at the bed and see the impression in the left pillow, I think about a woman who lived alone for 20 years in a bed that had been her and her husband's bed, and I close the door and I go downstairs and I make coffee in her kitchen, and the day begins. My wife Laurel found the Avery County property, and I will tell you that finding it was the thing she was best at in the years we spent looking, which was 2.5 years of weekends spent driving the mountain roads of western North Carolina, looking for the specific thing we had been describing to each other and to real estate agents and to anyone who asked what we were looking for, which was a house with a view, not a house near a view, not a house with a view available from a specific window if you stood at the right angle. A house from which the view was the primary fact of the property, the thing the house had been built to serve, the reason the house was in the particular place it occupied. We had been living in Charlotte for 11 years, and Laurel had been saying for 7 of those 11 that what she needed, not wanted but needed, was to be able to see the horizon from where she lived, to have the view be part of the daily experience of the house, rather than something you drove to on weekends. The Avery County Victorian was the house. I want to describe the view before I describe anything else about the property, because the view is necessary to understanding everything that follows. The house sits on the side of a ridge in the eastern part of Avery County, at an elevation that gives it a sightline down a long valley between 2 parallel ridges. The valley visible for perhaps 12 miles from the front porch, before the ridges close together at the far end, and the view terminates in the specific blue haze that distant Appalachian mountains produce in every season. In October, when we first saw the property, the valley was in full color from ridge to ridge, and standing on the front porch of the house, I understood immediately and completely why someone had built a house in this specific location, on this specific slope, at this specific elevation. The house had been built to hold the view. Every design decision the original builders had made was oriented toward the front of the house and the porch and the valley below. The property had been foreclosed after its owner, a woman named Cora Hensley, had been placed in a memory care facility following a decline in her condition that her neighbors and the county social services had managed jointly, there being no immediate family to take over the arrangement. She was 89. She had lived in the house for 62 years. The foreclosure had proceeded when it became clear that she would not return to the property and that there was no family to manage the estate and no financial mechanism to maintain the mortgage. The bank had done a clearance of the property's contents standard procedure and had listed it at a price that reflected the foreclosure circumstances rather than the market value that the property's condition and location would command. When we arrived for our first visit with the listing agent, the bank's representative met us at the house to walk through the clearance status. She was apologetic before she said anything specific, which is the manner of someone who has already identified a problem and is managing the delivery of it. She said the clearance team had done a full pass and had removed everything, but that there was one item that appeared to have been missed. She gestured toward the front porch. On the porch, centered, positioned to face the valley, was a rocking chair. It was a handmade chair, not from a craftsman in the formal sense, but from a person with the skills and the patience to make a thing well and for a specific purpose. The wood was black walnut, darkened further by years of exposure to the porch's weather, and the proportions were the proportions of a chair made for a specific person's body and a specific orientation. The seat height and the angle of the back and the length of the rockers, all suggesting a chair built to put its occupant at a specific eye level relative to a specific view. The chair faced the valley. It had been built to face the valley, and it was facing the valley. And it had been there long enough that the porch boards under the rockers showed the shallow, curved grooves of 60 years of use, the wood worn to the specific shape of this chair's particular arc. The bank's representative said the clearance team could come back for it. Laurel said no. She said it was a beautiful chair, and she was keeping it, and the bank's representative noted this on her paperwork, and we moved on to the walkthrough. The house was everything the listing had promised, and the view was what we had been looking for, and we made our offer the following week and closed in December. We moved in on a Saturday in January, which in Avery County means cold and clear, to the valley, visible all the way to its far terminus, in the specific winter clarity that strip-mowed deciduous ridges produce when the leaves are down and the air is cold, and there is nothing between the eye and the distance. Laurel stood on the porch for 20 minutes after the movers left, in her coat, with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, looking at the valley. I stood beside her for some of it and left her to it for the rest, which is what you do when someone is receiving what they have been waiting for. The rocking chair was between us and the railing, the chair positioned as it had been when we found it, and Laurel sat in it for a few minutes. And I could see from her expression that the proportions were right. For the view, the chair put her at exactly the eye level that the view required, the angle of her gaze when she sat in it, the angle that took in the full length of the valley from the ridge closure at the far end to the nearer sections where the farms and the lower roads were visible. We were busy the first week with the unpacking and the establishing of new routines, and I was not paying attention to the chair in any particular way. It was Laurel who noticed. She mentioned it on the 5th morning, over breakfast, in the way you mentioned something you have been noticing for a few days and are not yet sure whether to characterize as significant. She said she thought the chair had moved. I asked what she meant. She said the angle was different, that it had been facing slightly more to the right than it was facing now, that the orientation had shifted overnight. I said the wind maybe, that rockers on a flat porch surface can be moved by wind pressure on the chair's back. She said maybe. By the end of the 2nd week, she had been noting it consistently enough that we both acknowledged the pattern. The chair's orientation was not constant. It shifted not dramatically, not turning 90 degrees, but the small angular shifts of a person adjusting their seat to follow something specific in the field of view, the kind of micro-adjustments that someone makes when they are watching the light change in a valley across the course of seasons and are positioning themselves each time to see the particular element that is most interesting on a given morning. On a morning when the low fog was in the valley bottom, the chair was angled down. On a morning when the light was on the far ridge, the chair was angled up and right. I measured this. I measured the chair's position relative to the porch railing on a dozen mornings and recorded the measurements and plotted them, and the pattern was the pattern of someone watching the valley with sustained attention and adjusting their angle of observation as the view changed. Laurel said she wanted to ask about Cora Hensley. I said that was reasonable. We called the memory care facility, the one listed in the county's records of the foreclosure proceedings, and spoke with a staff member named Kay, who had the careful phone manner of someone who is accustomed to receiving calls about residents from people with complicated relationships to those residents, which in this case was a couple who owned the woman's house and were calling about a rocking chair. Kay listened to what Laurel described and was quiet for a moment, and then said something that I want to reproduce as precisely as I can, because the precision matters. She said that Cora Hensley asked about her chair every day. She said every day, not most days, not often. Every day, she said Cora asked whether her chair was still on the porch, and whether the view from the chair was still good, and whether whoever was in the house now was taking care of the house and looking after the view. Kay said the doctors believed Cora was experiencing confusion associated with her condition, which produces this kind of persistent referential concern about objects and places from the person's past. Laurel asked if Cora had said anything specific about the chair, what it meant to her. Kay was quiet again for a moment, and then said that Cora had told her, on a day when she had been more articulate than usual, that she had sat in that chair every morning of her life on that porch for 60 years and that she wasn't done yet, and that leaving the chair behind was the thing that troubled her most about where she was now. Laurel was quiet on the drive home from the errand we had been running when we made the call. I was driving and she was looking out the passenger window at the mountains, and I could see her processing what Kay had said, and I did not interrupt the processing. When we got home, she went directly to the porch and she sat in the chair for a few minutes and looked at the valley, and then she came inside. She said she thought we should leave the chair where it was. I said I thought so too. We have not moved the chair. We have not attempted to determine the mechanism of its movement. The measurements I took are in a notebook on my desk, and I have not added to them because adding to them began to feel like the wrong kind of attention to give to something that is not our business. Cora Hensley is 90 now, based on what the records showed. She is in the memory care facility, and she asks about her chair every day, and the doctors believe she is confused. On mornings when the view is particularly good, when the fog is in the valley in the specific way it gets in March, or when the light on the far ridge is doing what October light does on those ridges, I go to the front door, I look at the chair before I step out, and sometimes the angle of it has already changed from the day before, already adjusted for the morning's specific quality of light, and I stand in the doorway for a moment, and then I go back inside and let the morning be what it is. The chair knows where it is. The woman who made it hers for 60 years knows where her chair is. I think about Kay's voice on the phone saying she isn't done yet, and I think about Cora Hensley in a facility somewhere asking every single morning whether the view is still good from where the chair sits, and I find that I want to be able to answer that question for her honestly, which is that the view is still extraordinary, and that her chair is on the porch where she left it, and that whoever is in the house now is, in fact, taking care of it. We bought the Clay County cabin as a weekend property, and I want to be upfront about the specific kind of people we were when we bought it, because the kind of people you are affects what you notice, and when you notice it, and what you do with what you notice. Mara and I were both 32, both working in Asheville, she in landscape architecture, and I in building systems engineering, and we were both the kind of people who, when they look at a property, see the work rather than seeing only what is already finished. This is a professional disposition more than a personal one, but it shapes how you move through a space and what registers as significant. I mention this because when we finally understood what the handwriting on the board under the key hooks was showing us, we understood it the way people who are accustomed to reading evidence of work understand it, which is quickly and with a specific quality of certainty. The cabin came to our attention through a foreclosure listing that a friend forwarded because she knew we had been looking for a weekend property in the mountains, and the price was, as she put it, impossible. She was right that it was impossible. The Clay County foreclosure price was 40% below what the property should have commanded based on comparables in the area, which I verified before we drove out to see it, and which I attributed to the combination of the foreclosure circumstance and the nearly 3 years of vacancy that had allowed the property to develop the specific neglect that vacant properties develop when no one is maintaining them. We drove out on a Saturday in March and walked the property and the cabin with the agent who was handling the foreclosure sale, and we made our offer on the drive home. The backstory of the property came to us in pieces from the agent, from the county records, and eventually from a neighbor who had known the previous owner and who stopped by our cabin on our second visit to introduce himself and assess us, which is what neighbors in remote rural areas do when new people appear on a property that has been empty for a long time. The previous owner was named Clarence Webb, who had been a carpenter by trade and had bought the 6 acres in 1971 and had spent the better part of 3 years building the cabin himself, doing all of the framing and the finish work and much of the systems work. The kind of project that a skilled carpenter undertakes in the knowledge that what they build themselves, they build to the standard they have set for themselves, rather than the standard someone else's budget permits. The cabin showed this. Even after 3 years of vacancy, it showed the quality of someone who knew what they were doing and had done it with the intention of it lasting. Clarence Webb had lived in the cabin alone. He had never married, apparently for more than 50 years, until his death 2 years ago at 83. He had died intestate, and the estate had gone to cousins, who disputed it among themselves long enough that the property had passed to the county and then to foreclosure before anyone resolved anything. We took possession in April and began making weekend trips, alternating Saturdays and Sundays with the occasional full weekend when our schedules aligned. The renovation plan was gradual. We were not in a hurry, and the cabin, despite the 3 years of neglect, needed work that was real but not urgent. We had a priority list, and we worked through it in the order that logic and the season dictated. The work was the kind of work that Mara and I find genuinely satisfying, the kind that reveals the quality of what was already there, and that improves the use of the property without obscuring the character of the original construction. Clarence Webb had built a good cabin. Every time we cut into something to fix it, we found work that had been done well and that had aged well, and this produced in us the specific gratification of working on someone else's craft and finding it worth the respect. The board with the key hooks was mounted on the wall to the right of the kitchen door, approximately at eye level, which is where a person mounting a keyboard installs it, the height where you can see the hooks without looking up or down, where reaching for a key is the natural extension of your hand at your side. It was a small rectangle of pine, perhaps 8 inches by 4, stained dark, with 4 cup hooks screwed into the lower edge at equal intervals. We found it on our first visit, and we began using it immediately, hanging our own keys on the hooks and noting it as an existing feature that we were keeping. I gave it no further thought for the first 2 visits. It was on the 3rd visit that Mara noticed the underside. She had taken our keys off the hooks when we arrived, and in doing so had turned the board slightly in a way that showed her the reverse of it, and she called me over and we took the board off the wall and turned it over. On the underside, in pencil on the bare wood, was a list. The list was written in the handwriting of someone who writes quickly and for their own reference rather than for anyone else's reading, abbreviated, with specific terminology and shorthand that a person develops for their own notes. The handwriting not neat but consistent and legible once you understood its particular conventions. At the top, in slightly more deliberate lettering, a name, C. Webb. Below the name, a list. I want to describe the list carefully because the description is the evidence. The list was dated. Each entry had a date in the format that someone who has been keeping notes for a long time uses, month and day and year, abbreviated. The entries were task-based, the kind of running list that a person who lives alone in a remote property keeps to track what needs to be done: fix the second step, check the water heater anode, rehang the gate on the east fence, recaulk the window above the kitchen sink, clear the drainage ditch before winter. The kind of list. The format was the format of ongoing maintenance, items added as they were noticed and checked off or crossed out when completed. I looked at the dates on the list. The earliest entries were from the late 1990s and progressed forward through the 2000s and into the 2010s, which was consistent with a list that had been built up over decades. And then I looked at the most recent entries, the ones at the bottom of the list in the section of the wood that would have been blank when the earlier entries were written and had been filled in since. The most recent entry was dated 14 months prior. 14 months prior was 14 months after Clarence Webb had died. Mara and I looked at each other over the board. Then we went through the cabin and the property with the specific attention of people who are trained to read evidence of work. The second step of the front porch, the step that had been on the list, was new. Not refinished, not repaired in the way of an old board shimmed and renailed, but replaced with a new board, the wood pale against the weathered gray of the surrounding steps, the installation clean and competent in the way of work done by someone who has been building with wood for decades. The east gate had been rehung, the hinges were new, the fit tight, the swing smooth. The window above the kitchen sink had been caulked on the exterior, the caulk recent, the application careful. The drainage ditch on the uphill side of the cabin had been cleared, the debris piled in the specific way someone piles it, when they have been clearing ditches for a long time and know where to put the material so it does not wash back. We had not done any of this work. We had not hired anyone to do any of this work. We had not invited or authorized any person to be on the property in our absence. I went through the access log on the lockbox we had installed. The digital lockbox keeps a record of each entry, and the only entries in the log were Mara's and mine on our 3 visit dates. Nobody had used the lockbox. Nobody with a key we were aware of had been at the property. We drove home that Sunday in a quiet that was not the comfortable quiet of a productive weekend, but the specific quiet of 2 people processing the same information in parallel. We talked about it on the drive and on the phone during the week, and we came to the conclusions that methodical people come to when the evidence is what it is, that the work had been done, that we had not done it, that nobody we could account for had done it, and that the work was the work described in Clarence Webb's handwriting on the board that we had established was not a recent fabrication, because the pencil on the oldest entries was worn and faded in a way consistent with pencil, marks that had been on bare wood for 30 years. On the 5th visit, we took the board off the wall and turned it over before we unpacked. There was a new entry at the bottom of the list, in the same handwriting, dated 2 weeks prior. It described inspection and renailing of the roof flashing on the north face of the cabin. It was marked with the small check mark that the earlier completed entries were marked with. We put the board back on the wall and we went outside, and I got on a ladder and I looked at the north face of the roof, and the flashing had been inspected and renailed. The nails were new, the work was competent. I have been coming to this cabin for 2 years now. I look at the board on each visit. There is a new entry every few weeks, sometimes more, sometimes less, in Clarence Webb's handwriting, describing work he has done on the property he built in the 1970s and has apparently not stopped caring for since his death. The work is always done when we arrive. The work is always done well. The lockbox log never shows an unauthorized entry. We are the only people on the property between our visits, according to every mechanism we have for knowing that. Mara keeps a photograph of the board on her phone, updated on each visit, the new entries documented. I have stopped trying to resolve the situation because the situation does not resolve, it continues. And the continuation is the property receiving the maintenance of someone who built it himself and who has been maintaining it for 50 years, and who apparently considers the maintenance his responsibility, regardless of who owns the deed. The cabin is in better condition now than it was when we bought it, and some of that is our work and some of it is work described in pencil and C. Webb's handwriting on the underside of a keyboard mounted in the kitchen, and the list is still growing, and we check it every visit, and every visit it has added something to what was already there, and the work it describes has been done, and I have stopped being surprised by this and started simply noting it, the way you note the ongoing evidence of a careful person's attention to a place they care about, which is what it is, whatever else it also might be.